You may have noticed the headlines about trucks stalled at the border and helicopters overhead and assumed this was just another chapter in a familiar political storyline, another show of strong language, another border move, another round of pressure between Washington and Ottawa. But if that is all you noticed, you missed what is really unfolding here, and more importantly, why it matters for how power actually operates in the North American economy. Because this is not truly about drugs, it is not really about safety, and it is not primarily about Donald Trump or Mark Carney as individual figures. What we are seeing is the intentional exposure of an economic system that only appears efficient as long as no one ever pushes against it. What officially took place seems simple at first glance. The Canadian government directed its border agency to manually check every commercial truck entering from the United States, every pallet, every container, every bolt and crate. At the same time, Canada expanded visible enforcement along the border, including air patrols. The public explanation focused on border integrity and safety. The stated reasoning was clear. If the United States argues that Canada is a weak point in controlling illegal flows, then Canada will remove any doubt by inspecting everything. On the surface, this sounds technical, even dull, but here is the deeper truth most people were never told. Modern North American trade is not built to withstand friction. It is built to survive speed. The entire system of cross-border production depends on the assumption that trucks move almost without interruption. Auto plants do not stockpile weeks of components. Grocery distributors do not store months of produce. Everything is scheduled, sequenced, and synchronized to arrive just in time, because holding inventory costs money and eats into profit margins. When you insert a hard pause into that system, even briefly, the system does not flex, it breaks. This is where the economic lesson starts. For decades, corporations pushed for open borders for goods, minimal inspections, and streamlined customs, not because it benefited workers or communities, but because it maximized returns on capital. Governments on both sides largely went along, reshaping public institutions to serve private logistics efficiency. Border agencies became facilitators of trade rather than enforcers of rules. Now, suddenly, the same political forces that demanded frictionless trade are calling that system insecure. And Canada's response was not symbolic, it was structural. If you want a hard border, this is what a hard border actually looks like. The immediate effects are easy to predict. Trucks sit idle, drivers wait without pay, factories slow, perishable goods spoil. Assembly lines face shutdowns because one missing part stops an entire process. And notice who absorbs the cost first. Not the executives who argued for tariffs, not the shareholders protected by diversified portfolios. It is workers, logistics contractors, small suppliers, and consumers who pay through lost hours, higher prices, and instability. This is the part most media coverage largely avoids. Reporting centers on the spectacle of long queues and aircraft in the sky. It turns the moment into a story of toughness and retaliation. What it rarely asks is why the system was so fragile in the first place. Why an economy that calls itself resilient cannot handle inspections that were once routine. The answer, as usual, comes down to incentives. When profit maximization becomes the guiding logic of trade policy, redundancy vanishes, slack disappears, and public capacity is stripped away. Everything is optimized for speed, not safety, stability, or resilience. Borders turn into thin membranes instead of real institutions. So when political conflict returns, there is no buffer. The costs fall downward immediately. What you are witnessing at the border is not just congestion, it is leverage. Canada is making visible something that is normally hidden, that the movement of goods is power. That control over infrastructure procedures and compliance can matter just as much as tariffs or treaties, and that when one side weaponizes trade language, the other side can weaponize the mechanics of trade itself. This should unsettle you, not because Canada is wrong to assert sovereignty, but because it shows how exposed ordinary people are to decisions made far above them. When leaders posture, workers spend the day stuck in traffic. When supply chains lock up, families face higher prices and empty shelves. When systems designed for profit are strained, social stability cracks first. So as you watch this develop, do not just ask who flinched or who looked strong. Ask why an economy this large cannot tolerate inspection. Ask who designed it that way, and ask who gains from keeping it fragile. Because once you recognize that pattern here, you will start seeing it everywhere. If you want to keep breaking down these systems with me, stay involved, Share your thoughts and keep questioning the stories you are handed. That is how we learn to recognize power before it arrives as a crisis. Now let's slow this down and examine the structure underneath, because this is where the story grows far beyond a border dispute. What you are really watching is a clash between two very different uses of the state. On one side, the state is used rhetorically as a tool for blame and political performance. On the other side, the state is used operationally as a set of rules, procedures, and physical controls that shape how the economy actually runs. For years, politicians told the public that trade was frictionless because it was natural, efficient, and inevitable. But trade was never frictionless by nature. It was frictionless by choice. Governments deliberately removed inspections, cut staffing, automated approvals, and fast-tracked cargo because corporate lobbies demanded it. They wanted borders that behaved like toll booths permanently locked on green. That design choice had a price. It made corporations richer, but it also made the entire system dependent on political calm. The moment conflict re-enters the picture, the infrastructure exposes its weakness. You cannot instantly restore human inspection capacity to a system that spent decades eliminating it. You cannot suddenly demand security without slowing everything down. This is why the Canadian response matters. It is not just a policy move, it is a demonstration. By telling border agents to do what border agents were originally meant to do, inspect goods, verify compliance, and physically check cargo, the government is revealing how much modern trade relies on trust rather than enforcement, and once trust becomes political, it disappears quickly. Notice something else quietly taking shape here. The use of visible enforcement, added personnel, patrols, and stricter procedures sends a signal not only to Washington but to markets. It says access is conditional, speed is not guaranteed. Trade routes are shaped by policy, not permanent rights. This deeply unsettles corporations because it exposes a truth they prefer to keep hidden. Their power depends on predictability. Investors assume parts cross borders smoothly. They assume trucks move overnight. They assume inputs arrive on time. Stock prices silently embed those assumptions. When that predictability breaks, even briefly, risk calculations shift. And once again, who absorbs that risk first? Not capital. Capital hedges, capital spreads exposure, capital pressures for relief. It is labor that waits unpaid. It is small businesses that miss delivery windows. It is consumers who face price jumps labeled temporary, but rarely rolled back. This is why the discussion should never end with whether inspections are legitimate. The more important question is why the system was pushed so hard toward optimization that basic public oversight now appears like economic hostility. Media coverage sidesteps that question because it challenges the core story of modern capitalism. We are told that efficiency is neutral, that speed equals progress, that friction signals failure. But efficiency always benefits someone. Speed always creates winners. And when friction returns, it exposes whose interests were protected when it was removed. There is also a geopolitical lesson embedded here. For decades, the United States benefited from uneven openness. Goods moved in quickly. Enforcement costs were shifted elsewhere. Supply chains stretched across borders under the assumption of constant compliance. When tariffs were used as political tools, they targeted prices. What Canada has done instead is target movement. Prices can be absorbed, delayed, or passed along. Disrupting flow is far more destabilizing. It interrupts production itself. It forces managers to make decisions on the fly. It exposes dependence. This is not escalation by mistake. It is escalation by design. And it works precisely because the system was never built to withstand it. As you watch political messaging bounce back and forth, notice what is missing. No one is asking whether a just-in-time economy can survive political instability. No one is asking whether supply chains optimized for shareholder returns can coexist with democratic conflict. No one is asking why workers are expected to absorb the shock every time power struggles erupt at the top. These are not technical oversights. They are political decisions. And once you see that, the border stops looking like a line on a map and starts looking like what it truly is, a pressure point in a system that assumed pressure would never come back. There is another layer here worth your attention because it explains why this moment feels so unsettling, even for people far removed from trade or logistics. What is breaking down is not just traffic movement. It is the belief that economic systems exist above politics. For years, we were told that markets were neutral and that politics only interfered with them. But markets were always political arrangements enforced by public institutions. The border was never just a boundary, it was a negotiated space where the state decided how much authority to use and for whose benefit. When inspections were reduced, that was not the market winning, it was the state choosing capital's convenience over public control. Now that choice is being reversed, even if only partially, and it feels shocking because it exposes how artificial the previous normal really was. Think about how often you heard phrases like supply chain efficiency or trade facilitation. They sound technical, even helpful, but what they really meant was governments redesigning enforcement agencies to act as logistics partners for corporations. Speed became the measure of success, not verification, safety, or accountability. When political conflict re-enters the system, that partnership turns into a weakness. This is why industry groups react so strongly whenever inspections increase. It is not because inspections are new, it is because profit models were built on the assumption that inspections would be rare, superficial, and automated. Labor schedules, delivery contracts, penalty clauses, and pricing structures all depend on that belief. Once it breaks, everything downstream begins to shake. Again, notice who disappears from the public conversation. The truck drivers waiting in line are not setting policy. The warehouse workers sent home early are not responsible for tariffs. The grocery clerks explaining empty shelves are not negotiating trade deals. Yet they are the ones absorbing the friction. This is not accidental. It is structural. Capital pushes risk downward by design. When systems fail, the costs hit the least powerful first. That is not a flaw. It is how profitability at the top is protected. There is also a psychological dimension to this moment that matters. When governments visibly enforce borders, it shatters the fantasy of seamless globalization. People begin to realize that access can be restricted, that rules can change, that stability is conditional. That realization unsettles markets far more than any speech or press briefing ever could. This is why there is such urgency to frame the situation as temporary, abnormal, or excessive. The goal is to reassure investors that old assumptions will soon return, that speed will be restored, that friction will fade. Because once markets start factoring in uncertainty, capital demands concessions quickly, and this is where power reasserts itself. Corporations lobby, governments bargain, media narratives soften, pressure builds to normalize flow again. The inspection regime gets portrayed as overreach rather than a reminder of sovereignty. But pause here and ask something important. If inspecting cargo creates economic shock, what does that say about the system we have been living under? If safety, verification, and enforcement are treated as threats instead of necessities, whose interests were being served all along? This moment also exposes how selective the language of law and order really is. When enforcement slows corporate profit, it is labeled gridlock. When enforcement targets workers or migrants, it is called security. The difference is not principle, it is power. So when you hear outrage about trucks waiting and supply chains freezing, listen carefully to what is being defended. It is not trade in the abstract. It is a specific form of trade that prioritizes speed over resilience and profit over people. Once you recognize that pattern here, you will start seeing it in labor law, environmental rules, housing policy, and healthcare systems. The same logic repeats. Remove friction for capital, add friction for everyone else. The border is simply where that logic has become impossible to ignore. Now let's talk about why this kind of disruption feels so personal, even for people nowhere near the border, because the effects spread outward in ways that are rarely described honestly. When trucks stop moving, it is not just trade numbers that shift, it is the rhythm of daily life. Auto plants do not announce shutdowns as political statements, they call them scheduling changes. Grocery stores do not say supply chains broke, they say deliveries were delayed. Prices rise quietly, hours are cut without announcement. People feel the impact without ever seeing the source. This is one of the great advantages of modern economic systems for those at the top. Pain is spread thin, responsibility is nowhere to be found, and yet the cause is very specific. A system built around just-in-time logistics cannot absorb shocks because it was never meant to. It was designed to minimize cost, not maximize stability. Redundancy was labeled waste. Inventory was treated as a flaw. Workers were reduced to adjustable variables. When political conflict brings uncertainty back into the picture, there is no buffer. Everything tightens at once. That is why these border inspections matter beyond trade. They reveal how much of your daily life depends on invisible coordination enforced by public rules that were intentionally weakened. And when those rules are strengthened again, even slightly, the system reacts sharply. There is also an institutional story here worth paying attention to. Border agencies, like many public bodies, were reshaped over time to serve a narrow definition of success: faster flow, lower costs, fewer delays. Budgets, staffing, and performance measures were aligned with corporate expectations. When the mandate shifts, those institutions become pressure points. Officers are asked to do more with systems never built for it. Delays grow, stress rises, and blame moves downward onto frontline workers doing exactly what they were instructed to do. This is a familiar pattern. Public institutions are hollowed out in the name of efficiency, then criticized when they cannot instantly scale up during crisis. The same pattern appears in healthcare, emergency services, and infrastructure maintenance. Slack is removed, then shock arrives, and we act surprised when the system breaks. Meanwhile, the political story stays shallow. Leaders trade accusations. Media panels argue over tone and strategy. Almost no one asks whether an economy dependent on frictionless borders can coexist with aggressive trade policy at all, because that question leads somewhere uncomfortable. It leads to the conclusion that you cannot wage economic conflict without creating economic casualties, and those casualties are rarely the ones making the decisions. This is why the idea of a hard border carries so much force. It forces a collision between rhetoric and reality. You can promise toughness on television, but when toughness takes the form of inspection, verification, and delay, the costs become immediate and visible, and those costs expose another truth. Trade agreements and supply chains are not neutral systems. They are political deals. When those deals are disrupted, the illusion of inevitability falls apart. At that point, something important happens. People begin to notice that systems can be redesigned, that policy is a choice, that efficiency was prioritized because someone benefited from it. And that realization threatens entrenched power. Because once people understand that economic pain is not an accident but a design outcome, they start asking different questions, not just who caused the disruption, but why the system offered no protection to begin with. The border gridlock is not only a signal to Washington, it is a lesson for anyone watching. Stability without resilience is fragile. Efficiency without accountability is brittle. And an economy that runs only at full speed has no brakes when it needs them most. That is the deeper story moving through those rows of idling trucks. At this point, it becomes important to ask why the public conversation is so carefully steered away from these structural questions. The answer is simple. If people connect supply chain fragility to policy decisions, the myth of inevitability collapses. And once it collapses, accountability enters the frame. Mainstream coverage prefers to present this as a clash of personalities or a temporary standoff. It reduces the story to who looks tough, who flinched, who escalated. That framing is comfortable. It treats disruption as a character issue instead of a systems failure. It reassures viewers that once the personalities change, normal will return. But what if normal was the problem? The just-in-time economy was marketed as modern, lean, and advanced. In reality, it was always a gamble. It assumed permanent cooperation, minimal political conflict, and endless trust between governments whose interests do not always align. That gamble worked as long as power operated quietly and unevenly. The moment it became visible, the risk was exposed. This is where class becomes impossible to ignore. When borders slow, executives do not sit in trucks. Investors do not lose sleep at rest stops. CEOs do not explain delays to customers face to face. Those experiences belong to workers. The system ensures that inconvenience flows downward while leverage flows upward. Even the language reveals the hierarchy. When corporations face delays, the word used is disruption. When workers face delays, the word used is inefficiency. One is framed as an external shock, the other as a personal failure. This difference is not accidental. It is how power shields itself. By keeping the system opaque, responsibility stays abstract. By focusing the story on conflict between governments, corporate design choices remain hidden. But look closely at what this moment teaches. Borders are not just about sovereignty. They are about enforcement capacity. And enforcement capacity is political power. When a state chooses to exercise it, even briefly, it reminds markets that rules still exist. That reminder is destabilizing precisely because markets were trained to forget it. There is also a longer-term implication that deserves attention. Once supply chains are exposed as fragile, pressure builds not to rebuild them for resilience, but to shield them politically. Corporations respond by demanding exemptions, special corridors, trusted trader programs, and private compliance systems. In other words, they try to escape public enforcement rather than adapt to it. This is the familiar cycle. Public authority creates friction, private power lobbies to bypass it, governments compromise, and the system returns to speed, slightly more opaque than before.